Good evening, sir. How are you doing? Welcome to today's class.
Evening, ma.
Good evening, sir. Happy holidays. How are you doing, sir?
Happy Salah.
I wish you the best, sir. How is it
Uh,
going?
Alhamdulillah, it was great, honestly.
Oh, wow. That's so nice. That's so nice. Well done,
So,
sir. Please let's just give others like a few minutes. We'll start 9:06. I mean
okay,
7:06, sorry.
okay, we'll wait a bit, ma.
Like
Thank you.
like 3 minutes. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sir. All right, sir. It's already 7:06, so we have to start. Okay. So during our last class, sorry, sir. Did you say something?
I didn't.
Oh, okay, okay. So yeah, during our last class, we did a test, and we all saw how that impromptu presentation is something that gets better as we do it. And so today we're going to be having our last class before our exam on Saturday. But then before we get into the class, I just wanted to find out, sir, do you have any challenges, right? Is there anything that you're still trying to get a hold on, based on all that we've taught so far, plus the lessons that we've had, you know, and then the test as well? Is there anything you're still trying to get a hold on? Hi, Anne. Good evening. Welcome. How are you doing? How was your day? Hello? Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you, ma.
Okay, okay, sir. All right. So I don't know. Did you hear my question, sir? I was asking if there is anything that you would still need clarity on based on, all the classes we've done and then our test and stuff. Do you still need clarity on anything. Sorry.
Eloma, I think the most important thing I've learned is for somebody to be very calm, so that that will avail him the opportunity, to be organized. Because unless and until you are organized,
Mm,
hardly you can, gather your thought clearly and make a very reasonable presentation. And I think this is what
mm-hmm,
I'm struggling to, to manage, because precisely most of the time I try to rush things. And in as much as you are rushing,
okay.
the tendency for you to make mistakes or to overlook some key issues, it's not something that you can, run away from. But with the framework and the structures you have given us,
Okay.
I think if somebody is able to put them into practice, you'll be able to minimize, mistakes to a large extent. I thank you very much.
Mm. Okay, okay, that's great. So it means that so far no, you don't have any issues, because today's class we're going to try to be tackling individual issues, right? Like personal issues that learners might have, because this is like our last interaction, like a class before the exam. So if there are any other things that might have, been bothering you, or maybe something we didn't cover within this scope that you were looking forward to see, but now that we are almost at the end, you've not seen it, you can also raise it so that we can address it, right? It's just something of that nature.
I think I also have a question.
Okay, all right, sir.
I think we need to be given some other frameworks, like a framework for somebody, like for an closing remark,
Mm,
welcome remarks, and things like that. You know, that will help us, for us to achieve, you know, a higher degree of presentation skills.
okay, sir. So you said framework for closing remark. I'm trying to note it down so that we can actually attach it to um, the package that learners would receive at the end of the class. Okay, the reason why we're asking these questions is so that those things that you might have felt would have given you a holistic experience that was not included in the course content, okay, we can add it. So you said framework for closing remark and opening remark, right?
Like that, and things like that, because
Sir?
they are and things like that, they are fundamental. In an event, one can
Okay.
be asked to, to make an opening remark, a
Mm-hmm.
closing remarks, make maybe
Yeah.
a welcome remark, and things like that.
Okay.
What is
Okay.
the framework? What
Um.
is the basic framework that is to be, for one to achieve success in terms of that delivery?
Okay. So there is no framework that is set in stone, right? Every speaking engagement has its own, unique framework. But for opening remarks, it basically depends on the event. All right, what kind of event is it? If it's an opening remark for, let's say, a book launch, all right, the framework is going to be quite different from an opening remark of a wedding ceremony. All right, there is no set in stone framework for all of these speaking engagements. But what we're going to do is, since we are interfacing with professionals and our course content was designed for professionals, when we are attaching the offboarding package that learners are supposed to get, we're going to try to attach these frameworks and some other materials that you could always use to refresh your mind. And then, because we have 4 weeks access to the academy, which is once a week, every Saturday, right? There is going to be a time designated for conversations like this, all right? So in those periods, we can actually also review some of these frameworks that were not taught in class and then start practicing them as well. Okay, but I think the main thing is to ensure that there is a holistic experience for the learners. All right, so Your suggestions have been well noted, sir, and thank you very much for raising that. Okay, that was really impactful. We're going to definitely, include it because just like you said, they are inevitable part of a professional's life, and we have to cover that as well. So thank you so much. So today is day 5, impromptu presentation mastery for professionals. And as usual, it is think and speak on the spot. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Today is impromptu performance lab 2. All right, so we're supposed to have our second assessment today. We're supposed to have our second assessment today because the assessment is not yet complete. We're not able to finish that during the last class that we had. We're not able to finish our assessment because we had to save time. We're already running out of time. All right, so currently we have to make sure that we finish that as well and see how we can practice these other frameworks. Okay, so let's look at the objective for today. What do we aim to achieve? Right, by the end of today's session, learners will be able to respond to impromptu prompts with improved confidence and reduced hesitation. Participants will demonstrate effective use of speaking frameworks in timed speaking exercises. Participants will also be able to deliver clearer and more structured responses in preparation for assessment. Okay, so before we get into the test, all right, I also want to ask, you know, what do you think um what do you think made you register for this course, and has that been attended to through the learning process? Okay, so like I said earlier, today is going to be more like a one-on-one session, okay, with everyone. We're going to try to have like a one-on-one session, all right? While we wrap up, we just want to ensure that we are um, covering the most important things that needs to be covered. So before you started the class and now, okay, what was the one thing that made you register for the class, and then has that concern been addressed, please? So Salih, I'm still speaking to you. Thank you.
I can hear you, Master. I think that the major
Okay.
thing I have achieved is the issue of I'm now under I'm now in the view and in the picture that any speaking engagement is supposed to be done in a structured way,
Okay.
because that will allow you to, not only to organize your thoughts, but it makes you, to speak clearly and with a very logic, presentation of your ideas. And that will make the
Mm-hmm.
audience, to understand and as well as to appreciate what you are saying.
Okay, okay. So it means that before the course, like prior to the course, that was not obtainable. Okay, like most times when you're called to speak, it's more like you just get into the speaking and try to like finish. But now with the courses, I mean, with the course and then the frameworks that we're able to look at, you've been able to get better at structure, right?
Exactly, ma.
Oh, okay. All right, beautiful. Thank you so very much, sir. Thank you. Right, so let's get into the next slide. So yeah, what is the section breakdown for today? Now the first section is going to be our live drill as usual, which is going to last for 40 to 45 minutes. And the second section is going to be teaching, right? We're still going to have to teach, but what we're going to be teaching is basically a review and reinforcement of what learners struggled with using previously taught frameworks. All right, now we're going to also have a re-drill slash application, which is when corrections are made, we'll now have another round of the test. So in total, we're supposed to have 4 tests. Okay, we have done the first two, so today we're supposed to do the second two. Okay, and then there's also going to be a feedback, just like what we did in the last class. We're also going to be redoing that again today. All right. So, but just give me a minute, a few minutes. Let me drop something for my assistant, please. Thank you so much. Okay, sir. So, we're back. Sorry for the break in transmission. All right. So, while we are waiting for other persons to come on board, a few persons took permission. I know someone mentioned that they have a sick child, and a few persons also took permission. All right. So while we're waiting for them to come on board, I think we'll just have to start your assessment, sir. All right. We're going to be looking at the story framework. All right. And I don't know, but let me just be sure. You know what the story framework is, yeah? Based on our previous class. Sorry,
The
let me
one
bring
you
it to
use
stage.
past, present, and future to explain
Yeah.
the story.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. All right. I don't know if you're eating, sir, because it sounded like you're eating at the moment.
I'm eating meat, ma.
Oh, okay, that's all right. It's okay. It's fine. It's all right, sir, no problems. So yeah, what's it called? We're supposed to use that framework today, which is past, present, and future. Okay, but since you're eating, let me just skip this test and go back to review, right? Just to allow you settle in and then allow some other persons to also join the class. All right, so part two is supposed to be teaching based on what learners showed. All right, so we're going to just have like a little revision based on what we've done previously. All right, we're going to have a little, okay, we're going to have a little revision based on what we have actually done previously. All right, so let's say for instance in a speaking situation where someone was called up to make a presentation and they froze. Okay, so one thing we have to ask ourselves is, why did I freeze? Right? Because what makes a great communicator great is your ability to sit down and take responsibility or take ownership of a speaking outcome. All right, so if you're supposed to make a presentation and for some reason you froze, all right, you have to ask yourself, oh, why did I freeze in this moment? Now let's change the scenario. Let's say after maybe the person has taken the course. Okay, let's say after this speaking engagement, after these 6 days or 2 weeks of training, and you're still at a speaking engagement and you notice you froze. Okay, after this speaking engagement, you have to sit down and ask yourself, why did I freeze? Right? Did I freeze because I didn't use the structure that we learned in class? Or did I freeze because I was thinking too much? All right. And one of the strongest things, or one of the greatest things that happens to most speakers under pressure is they start thinking too much. All right. And that alone can actually cause them to freeze. I know that in one of our classes, we talked about how that when you are overthinking, it causes your brain to freeze. All right. So if in any speaking situation, and even after this course is over and you are called to speak or you are in a speaking engagement and you notice that you froze at any point, the first thing to do is to ask yourself, oh, why did I freeze? Right? What exactly made me freeze? All right. And then you now have to start diagonizing the conversation. And that's why after this course, we would usually advise that you when you go for a speaking engagement, try to rewatch the recording, okay? And then also, while preparing for a speaking engagement, you can actually record yourself, like record yourself making the presentation. Okay, like that's one way to actually observe your facial expression. That's one way to observe your tone. That's one way to observe your eye contact. That's one way to also observe your speed and observe your own organization, your ability to organize your thoughts, right? Because most times what usually happens is that when people take a course like this one that we have actually taken, right? And then they feel like, oh, I've learned the frameworks and I'm waiting for my next speaking opportunity. And the speaking opportunity comes and you go through the frameworks again, and then you get on stage and all the frameworks are clashing in your head. So instead, the best thing to do is when you finish learning the course, all right, like we're rounding up today against our exam on Saturday slash our offboarding, all right, when you finish taking the course, you have to start practicing by recording yourself, okay? Because the more you hear yourself speak, the more comfortable you are with your own voice. Now, there's one thing that happens to a lot of persons is that they're not yet comfortable hearing themselves speak. A lot of people are not comfortable hearing themselves speak, right? And so most times when they are called to make a presentation and they hear their own voices, they are wondering, oh, is it me? Is that my voice? Because they are not used to hearing themselves speak, okay? And sometimes it's simply because the kind of work they do doesn't necessarily allow such, or even if it does, sometimes it's always under pressure, all right? So the way they sound under pressure and the way you sound when you are at ease are not the same thing. And that is why it's always advisable that before you make a presentation, or after you've taken a communication course or a course on impromptu presentation or any course on communication at all, the best thing to do is to make sure that you consistently practice speaking and recording yourself, all right? Now when you give yourself a task, okay, so part of the things we're going to be adding to the offboarding kit is different prompts, okay? So the exam that we wrote, those questions that we're asking, they are called prompts, all right? So we're going to be adding different prompts for different frameworks, all right? Now you practice recording yourself speaking, all right? The moment you do that thing consistently, it becomes a part of you. The moment you record yourself speaking consistently, it becomes a part of you, and then you get comfortable hearing yourself talk, right? Many persons are not comfortable hearing themselves talk, and it invariably makes them surprised. And that's one of the reasons why people freeze. All right. Because so today we're going to be looking at unconventional reasons why people freeze. Okay. Now the first one is speaking without structure. Now you might have taken the course, or after taking the course, you still get on stage and somehow all the frameworks vanish from your head because of that pressure that comes with the moment. Now what do you do in that instance when you've taken the course and you still struggle with remembering the frameworks? Now what you need to do is to always start with what you know. Okay, let's say for instance you have successfully memorized all the frameworks, and then you now get to a speaking engagement and you realize that, oh, I'm still struggling, and just because I learned frameworks and I'm trying to stay within the frameworks, but it looks like I'm even struggling with these frameworks, what do I do? Now the best thing to do at that point is to start from what you know. All right, now what do I mean by start from what you know? So in a situation where you have learned these frameworks and then you are called to make a presentation and you notice that you're struggling, all right, the best thing to do is to start from what you know, okay? And especially when it's in a high stake environment where it looks like your integrity will be questioned or your leadership might be questioned, okay? When you start from what you know, it gives your body the ability to relax, all right? So just because we're learning these frameworks, now the reason why I am saying this is so that we don't get boxed in frameworks that when we forget the frameworks, it becomes almost impossible for us to be able to put our thoughts together. All right. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is so that we don't get boxed in frameworks that the moment we forget these frameworks, frameworks, it becomes almost impossible to put ourselves together. All right. But the moment you start from what you know, it makes it's easy for you to connect the dots. All right. So let's say, for instance, you're called up impromptu to make a presentation, and the situation is, around your work or something that you do every day. Okay. Now, your ability to start from what you know actually gives you a soft landing. What does that mean? It means that yes, you might feel the pressure. You might have noticed that, oh, all the frameworks you learnt in class have automatically disappeared from your head, and it almost feels like you are on the verge of embarrassing yourself. But you don't need to force your brain to remember the framework at that instance, right? Because sometimes people can invariably start forcing themselves. Oh, I must remember this framework. If I don't remember the framework, I'm not going to speak. Now, that pressure of even trying to remember the framework puts you under more pressure and also makes you freeze for a longer period of time. Instead, when you have done your mental check that, oh, it looks like I can't remember this framework, so what do I do? I start with what I know. Okay, I start the conversation with what I know. And if along the line, the framework that you have designed to use for that presentation, comes back into your head, you have actually started. All right. What makes impromptu presentation embarrassing for people is that they freeze for too long, that it becomes obvious that they have frozen. Okay, when a person is supposed to start a presentation and they stay quiet for way longer than necessary, it actually tells people that this person has a situation, that this person has a problem, that something is actually wrong at this point. All right. And then that situation now puts the person under pressure. But if you are able to start from what you know, it breaks the ice. Okay, so let's say you are being called impromptu, for instance, to give a closing remark. And just like you shared, sir, like what framework is used for a closing remark. Now let's look at an instance where the closing remark is on, let me say, I don't want to use Children's Day because that's not like a conventional everyday thing. But let's just say the closing remark is on climate policy, for instance, something that is around the government, something that affects the people, and then you are called to give a closing remark on climate policy. All right. Now, the first thing to do is not to struggle with which framework suits this situation, because climate policy, you're not going to come and start telling them stories. You're not going to start with point, reason, example point, which is prep. You might not even start trying to use the pitch framework, right? So at that instance, what do? You start by acknowledging the organizers of the event. All right. So if you're called to give a closing remark on an event around climate change, you start by thanking the persons who organized the event and also thanking them for having you on board. Let's say you're called as maybe the chairman of the event, or someone that is among the dignitaries, right? You start by appreciating them for having you there, irrespective of the fact that you might actually be the highest dignitary on that table. All right, it's always very humble to acknowledge people or organizers for having you in the room. All right, so you can start by appreciating the persons who organized the event. Then, based on how you were able to pay attention to the event, one speaker or the other might have said something that stuck with you. And that is why in every event it is always very necessary for participants to be present. All right, so if you go for an event and you're not sure if you're going to be called to make a presentation, the best thing to do in that situation is to be present. All right, so if you go for an event and you're being called to make a presentation, the best thing to do for that event is to be present. Right, you go for an event and then you're not so certain, oh, are these people going to call me to make a presentation? Am I going to be called upon to make a presentation? The best thing you have to do at that instance is to be present. All right, to show up at the event with the mindset that it is very possible for you to make a presentation, and that is one mindset that will actually help you stay present at that event. Now, probably when one or two speakers were talking, you picked something from them. Now, after you appreciate the persons that organized the event, you can now link what the person or what one of the speakers said. You don't necessarily need to remember the person's name, but you can say something like, thank you to the organizers of this event for having me here today. It is my honor and pleasure to be here to discuss the issues of climate policy in Nigeria. While one of the speakers was talking, I noticed he mentioned something around the governor's effort towards climate implementation. That goes to tell us how important climate change is. For instance, now you see, I did not stick to a framework, but the moment I said for instance, the first thing that came to my mind was prep, because I've actually started using examples. All right, I didn't try to start the opening remark with a framework. Okay, instead what I did was to acknowledge the persons that organized the event. All right, now I now went over to use 1 point or 2 points from what the other speakers have said. Okay, and then I now moved ahead to add, for example, we can all see how our economy is, I mean, how the weather is crashing because of the sun, because of, the use of fuel and all of that. Now, your ability to carry the audience through the event and then end with your own thoughts now makes it more like a personalized experience for the audience. It shifts from trying to stick to a rule to getting flexible with these things. Okay, because I think one of the best things that can happen to a speaker is to understand these frameworks and know how to use them. Okay, because flexibility is what makes knowledge stick. All right, your ability to take a course and now get so good at it that you're now able to use it as it comes. All right, so most times what happens to us is that we try to stick to these things, and sometimes rigidity actually puts us under tension. All right, because when you, just like when you cram something and you are now trying to make sure that that thing does not leave your head, over time you start struggling with that thought as to, oh my god, I don't want to forget this thing, I don't want to forget this thing. At the end of the day, you end up forgetting that thing. So in order for us to be on the safe side, especially having been exposed to these frameworks and how they are being used, the best thing to do is to not always stick to, okay, I must start with points, I must give a reason, I must give an example, then I must end with points, or I must start with something that happened in the past, I must give what is happening in the present, and then I must end it with a future example. It doesn't always follow like that. All right, what usually happens is that we always have to learn how to be flexible with these things. All right, now from my own closing remark, you can see that I didn't try to start with maybe giving a point. All right, so if I'm trying to stick to prep for a closing remark, I can say something like, oh, thank you for having me. You see, climate change can be defined as the shift of the weather, yada 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 yada. Then you now give your reason for that, you give example. It makes it very, it makes it uptight for the listeners. All right, but somewhere at the back of your mind, you know that, okay, you're trying to own the presentation, you're trying to own this moment. All right, now in owning the moment, you have to first relax. After you've done your relaxation technique, you've taken your emotions down, you've calmed your brain and all of that, next thing to do is to start from what you know. All right, and most times we'd also advise that in every speaking situation, try to start from what you know. There is no law that says that, oh, you must use a framework. Now, the reason why these frameworks are created is just so that it gives you a guide. But if at any point, especially for persons who have taken this course up to this level, and you realize that you are in a speaking situation and some of the frameworks that we gave in class does not coincide or correlate with the speaking situation that you are in, the best thing to do is to start from what you know. All right, once you start from what you know, you will see that the thing starts coming in gradually, you get more comfortable. And I like to say this, the first 1 minute of every speaking engagement is usually the most difficult. Okay, I'll say that again. The first 60 seconds, that's 1 minute of every speaking engagement, is usually the most difficult. The more you speak in a speaking engagement, the easier it becomes, the more relaxed it becomes. And I know that some of us have really experienced it, right? The moment you're called on stage to make a presentation, at that instance, that first appearance, that is when the highest pressure is being felt, right? Because maybe someone just left, and especially if the person did a wonderful presentation. Okay, so that's something I'm also going to be speaking on as we progress. All right, when somebody makes a presentation that is really powerful and you are called upon to make a presentation, you know that because the audience have actually created a pedestal based on what they experienced from the previous speaker, you would be under undue pressure to also make sure that you create that same level of experience for them, or you make sure that you're trying to match up to that shoe. It's like you're trying to fit into a shoe that the person has already created. Now, one thing you need to understand is as a professional speaker, right, it is not your job to match the energy of a previous speaker. Sometimes it also happens in the opposite, where that you might come on stage and the person that spoke last actually killed the energy of the audience. Now the audience are coming to your own conversation or what you have to say from an energy that is already depleted because the previous speaker did a terrible job with carrying the audience along. Now, what do you need to do in that kind of situation? Firstly, I would address the one where the speaker came in with high energy and you're supposed to feel in that energy. All right. Now, one thing you need to do is to acknowledge the speaker that just spoke. What do I mean? If you are being called upon to make a presentation and the speaker that spoke before you, you know, left the air with so much power in it and the audience are still in rave of that energy, what you can do to make sure that you maintain the energy is to actually acknowledge the speaker. What do I mean? You can say, wow, that was a beautiful presentation. Or you can start by introducing yourself, right? You can start with, good evening, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon, whatever the time is. My name is Marigold Okoye. But before I proceed into what I have to say, I would like us to take a minute to appreciate the previous speaker. That was a powerful presentation. Now, you can actually say, oh, let's give him another round of applause, or let's take a moment to give another round of applause. All right. Now you have actually set the you have taken the energy back to a certain level, and you are now the one in charge of that energy. It's more like a psychological thing where people just finished experiencing a certain level of excitement, or they just finished having a certain level of, you know, feel with a particular speaker, and then you're trying to fit into that shoe. But instead of coming on stage and trying to make the next conversation about you, you can actually take a moment to celebrate the other speaker while you're still on stage. Now, what this does is that it makes you more receptive to the audience. You know that human beings have a way of staying longer in a place that the energy is high, right? People like where the energy is high. So for you to be able to keep the audience attention longer on yourself, what you need to do is to acknowledge the previous speaker. All right, so by the time you say something like, wow, that was a beautiful presentation, please let's take a moment to appreciate, you know, the last speaker. Your presentation was amazing. You can even say one thing that you learned from his own presentation, and then the audience claps for him, and you now try to settle the audience. All right, now the moment you do this, you would realize that everything becomes lighter, the audience become more receptive, the audience become a lot calmer, the audience become more in tune to listen to you because they see you as human. Okay, one thing that is very common when it comes to speakers in different events is that they are very, very competitive. Human beings are naturally competitive by default. Okay, when a person has made a beautiful presentation, sometimes we struggle to acknowledge that this person has actually made a beautiful presentation because you feel like, oh, you are also a, you know, an honorable person. You have to come in your own class, you have to come in your own weight and all of that. You now want to compete. You're coming from a mindset of competition, and that competition actually puts you under pressure because you're trying to outdo what the other person has done just to be seen in that certain light of glory. And sometimes that thing alone actually makes people struggle. That thing alone actually makes people, you know, lose their line of thought because you are so focused on trying to outbeat the other person's record that you are not even present enough to create an atmosphere for your own body to calm down. All right, most times it happens to almost every speaker. Okay, when the previous speaker has taken the presentation to a certain height and you're coming in to fill that gap, most times they come from a place of competition. You are competing with that person's record, you're competing with what that person has done, and this now makes it almost impossible for you to concentrate on what you're there to do. For you to be able to deflect that feeling and create an atmosphere that is very receptive, not just to the audience but to yourself, you have, by acknowledging that person's performance, you have actually eased your own personal expectations on yourself. By acknowledging that person's performance, you have also brought down the tension on your own end. All right, and this thing is very powerful. It's such a powerful psychological switch that actually teaches the body how to stay calm. Okay, and because we know that, life does not follow a blueprint, it's always important that we look at things from different angles. Now, let's just say, for instance, that you now meet the opposite of what I explained, right? What I explained initially was that when you get into a speaking engagement and, the speaker carried the atmosphere to a certain height, and let's say reverse is the case, you are called to speak after a speaker has dropped the energy. Now, this particular one is a little bit more sensitive because the audience have emotionally checked out. Okay, and you know that for every speaking engagement, there is a certain level of emotion or a certain level of emotional state that the audience needs to be in for you to be able to do certain things and get the results that you want. For instance, if the audience are emotionally checked out and you want to do like some conversation starters, like look, let's take a picture and do a selfie, or let's say the theme of the conference, the feedback you might get can throw you off balance. All right, and that is why it's very important that you are, as a professional communicator, you learn to read the room. You read the room of the audience. Okay, what are they expecting? What are these people trying to receive? In what mental state are they in? All right, so if the previous speaker actually diminished the energy, what you can do as someone who is trying not to actually let the feedback from their own presentation affect your own confidence is to start with, acknowledging the audience. Right, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for yourself. It has been a long stretch of amazing speakers. I'm sure that all of you have learned one thing or the other, and sometimes you can be clapping for the speakers without recognizing yourself. Please clap for yourselves for taking the time to be here. Turn to your neighbor, appreciate yourself. Now you have recognized them. Okay, these things are little things, but they change the atmosphere for a speaker. All right, now let's say, for instance, you're called to give a closing remark and the event has overstretched. All right, this is where one of this technique can actually come in, because, or let's just say a closing remark is too it's a bit informal, sort of, for what I'm trying to say. Or let's say you're the last speaker before the closing remark. Exactly, you're the last speaker before the closing remark. You know that the audience have already mentally checked out. Now, what you can do is to acknowledge the audience. All right, because what really makes a lot of speakers freeze or lose their line of thought, or start rambling, is because the feedback they are getting from the audience is not encouraging them to continue. Whether we like it or not, audience feedback plays a major role in how we are able to continue our presentation. All right, I know that some of these things I'm saying now, we didn't learn it in class, and that's why every class is very important. Every class is as important as the first class. Okay, now what you need to do is to reverse engineer the minds of the audience. Everyone has been focusing on, the MC would say, oh, let's call Miss Marigold to come and give us a speech on the importance of climate change in Nigeria and the effects of, fuel and all of that and all of that. They will clap for this speaker, clap for the next speaker, clap for the third speaker. They keep clapping for people and no one really recognizes them. Okay, now for you to be able to get a positive reaction from this audience, you have to recognize the audience. All right, so if you know that your time that you were called to speak is close to when the audience are already exhausted, now you can ask yourself, oh, how do I know that the audience are exhausted? After all, when they called my name, they clapped. Now if you're someone that pays attention to energy, you'd realize that the same energy they used that or they had when they started the event is not the same energy that they'll have when the event is almost coming to an end. All right. And so in that state of emotional depletion, the best thing you can do is to recognize the audience. Most times the audience are always overlooked in events because they feel like most people feel like they are doing the audience a favor. After all, they are the ones that need this thing. For instance, you come to an event, maybe on finance and all of that, and they are bringing experts from different walks of life. To a very large extent, people start or speakers start having this mindset that they are doing the audience a favor. No, without the audience, there is no speaking engagement. Without the audience, there is no event. All right, so you can put up a very beautiful event with amazing decoration, amazing flyer, do your sponsored ad, run social media advert, pay influencers, and if nobody shows up for that event, you did not have an event. You just wasted money on publicity. You did not have an event. All right, so we have to start making it very, very audible that the audience are part of the event. In fact, they are the event. If you are organizing an event for children and no child comes to that event, you didn't have an event for children. You just created flyer and awareness about your event. All right, the moment you can call something an event is that organizers set out an agenda to reach a certain target audience, and they were able to do that. And now, because they were able to achieve this target by, for instance, let's say we put out our course flyer targeting professionals and nobody signed up for the course. We actually did put out a flyer, right? We did our best to market the course, but if nobody signed up for the course, then we didn't have an event, we didn't have a course. We did not have a course, we just had marketing. All right, that is the same thing that happens when you go to an event. And that is why most times when we are trying to address the learners in our community and the persons who are within the academy, we always make sure that we accord them the highest respect that is due them, because without them there is no academy. So we always have to have that mindset, as speakers or as communicators, that the audience should be acknowledged. Now, the reason why I'm sharing all of this is that when you get into a speaking situation and you notice that the speaker that went before you dragged the energy of the conversation downwards, it is your responsibility to actually put the audience in the right frame of mind to be able to receive you. All right. Now, the best way to do this, like I said, is to tell the speakers to clap for themselves. Tell the audience to clap for themselves. Now, when people clap for themselves, they feel seen. They feel, okay, now we're part of this event. We're not just here to fill up the number. All right. So that is one strategy you can use to actually have your remarks or your presentation or anything at all that you're doing without necessarily sticking to a framework. Okay, most times, if you want, the more you focus on sticking to a framework without actually mastering all these other determinants of a successful speaking engagement, you can stick to the frameworks and still fumble, because with the frameworks in check, you are still struggling to connect with the audience. You are still struggling to have a proper presentation. You are still struggling to get the reaction that you need. And whether we like it or not, audience feedback, like I said, plays a key role in how we are able to continue our presentation, in how we perceive ourselves, in how well we are able to flow. Because if you're talking to someone or if you're giving a presentation and the audience are just staring at you like, please do fast and go now, that feedback, that facial expression feedback actually makes you uncomfortable. But it changes the dynamic when you are making a presentation and you look to your left, people are smiling, you look to your right, your audience is nodding, you look around you, people are like cheering you on. It makes you want to continue. But if just picture that you're the one speaking and everyone is sleeping or people are on their phone, and you now be saying, you understand me, right? Nobody's answering you. You get what I'm saying? Yeah, nobody's responding to you. Eventually, that alone can throw you off guard. So the best you can do is to make sure that you drag the audience to the emotional state you want them to be in, so that you can actually pass your message and it lands on a heart that is willing to receive what you have to say. All right, so let's check this slide. Now, another thing that happens even after you might have perfected these frameworks that was being taught is thinking too much. Okay, now what does thinking too much means? Sometimes thinking too much is not that you are thinking too much about the presentation. Sometimes you can think too much about the framework that it now becomes a hindrance. All right, now the reason why we are saying this is to debunk the feeling that without a framework you cannot make a presentation. These things are not created, like I said, as blocks or rigids that it must follow like this. No, instead what these frameworks do is that they give you a guide to structure your thoughts. But if in any situation you have tried and you can tell yourself the honest truth that you're not remembering any of these frameworks, try as much as possible not to think too much about it. Or maybe you're in a speaking situation and 2 or 3 frameworks are clashing in your head. Okay, maybe you're called to make a presentation and you now tell yourself, should I use prep? Oh, point, reason, example, point. Is prep going to make sense here, or should I use story? Should I use that one? And now ask yourself, oh, should I use the explanation framework? Hey, which one will make more sense here? That thing alone actually destabilizes you, because in that instance you're trying to validate the framework more than validating the moment. All right, now what do I mean by this? You're trying to stick so much to the framework that you forget that this is a life moment. This is now, it's happening now, the pressure is now. All right, so the best thing you can do in that situation is to ensure that you take your head off any framework that is moving in your head, and focus on what you know. All right, it still comes back to what you know. Okay, but one thing we have to emphasize is that frameworks are beautiful, but they should not become a problem, especially when you are in a situation and you are trying to carry the whole frameworks on your head. Okay, now you're asking yourself, if I use prep, will I be able to communicate this thing well? What if I use the story framework? Will I be able to share this thing better? Okay, if I use explanation, will this one do this one well, or should I use the 3-point structure framework? That thing can actually make you numb, because in that moment your brain was not built to process all of these frameworks immediately. Okay, now the best thing to do is always take it one step at a time. Calm yourself. Think of, okay, this question, try to answer the question from a point of logic. All right, now what does logic teach you? Logic teaches you to process things from a point of awareness, knowledge. All right, with logic, it's that it tells you that, oh, I have an idea about this thing. In as much as I do not want to come off as someone who is over opinionated or is scattered in my presentation, I know that I have an idea about this thing. So the best you can do is to start with that idea that you have. Okay, I'm going to address this thing from the point of the idea that I have. All right, now with this idea that you already have about this thing, it makes it easier for you to reduce the thinking. Don't dwell so much on the framework that you now forget the moment. Now it now becomes like information overload, because information overload is a real thing. It happens to the best of speakers, that you are so grounded or you are so used to these frameworks to the extent that it now becomes a prison. So if you are in a situation where none of these frameworks are clicking, you are now stranded or you're struggling with information overload, and that is even more terrible than not knowing these frameworks at all. Now, no starting sentence habits. All right, okay, so what does a starting sentence habit mean? There are persons that if they want to make a presentation, they must first and start with greeting. It's a starting sentence habit. All right, now there are people that if they want to say something, they cannot say something without acknowledging the organizers. It's a starting sentence habit. All right, now these starting sentence habits can actually help you put yourself in order. For instance, for me, my own starting sentence habit, especially when I'm making a presentation, is greeting. I must greet the audience. Oh, good evening, distinguished ladies and gentlemen can never leave my mouth. It has become a part of me. We have also transferred it to the academy. You can't try to make an announcement without recognizing the person is there, even if they are not distinguished, put it, because that is giving people the honor that is due them. All right, so every speaker has their starting sentence habit. There is something that you use to start your sentence. For me, it's good evening, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. If it's afternoon, good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. If it's morning, good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. That is my starting sentence habit. Okay, some other people can start with acknowledging the organizers. You know, when you call them to make a presentation, the moment they take the mic, they will say all protocols duly observed. That is a starting sentence habit, especially when they are not the first speaker. Some persons can say, oh, all protocols duly observed. Before I get into my presentation, I just want to take a moment to thank the organizers, to thank everyone who has put this event in place. You know, your hard work, your consistency, your commitment will not go unnoticed. Those are starting sentence habits. Because with these things, it actually gives you a soft landing. One thing I know about communication and presentation is that there is no golden rule. Communication is a flexible skill. Effective presentation is a flexible skill. Now, what makes it more interesting is your ability to stay flexible. All right, now don't get stuck to a particular thing that it now becomes a prison. So some persons actually use their starting sentence habits to get themselves on track and stop themselves from freezing, because you don't need a framework to greet people. You don't need a framework, you know, to appreciate people for the work they've done so far. The moment you are able to start speaking, somehow every other thing flows. But why people freeze and stay frozen for a very long time is because they are not able to open their mouth in the moment. They are so engrossed with the shock of the event that they're not able to speak at the moment. But if you create a starting sentence habit, whatever the situation is, you know that this is your go-to kit for starting any presentation. All right, so the moment you are able to say those things, you have already kickstarted the presentation, and somehow you just keep flowing. Somehow it just keeps coming. Somehow it just keeps coming. All right, but if you are trying to stick to a framework without realizing that these things are not set in stone, even when you have a brilliant point to make, because you've stayed quiet for so long, you've created an impression in the minds of the audience that you don't know what you're doing. And nobody wants to ever work with someone or listen to someone that comes off like they don't know what they are doing. And there's this thing that, you know, people say that you do not have a second chance to rewrite a first impression. It's very true. It happens with the audience. All right, so that first 1 minute of you getting the audience attention invariably determines how well they will pay attention to you as you go on. Okay, so if you are able to get their attention in that first 1 minute by maybe practicing your starting sentence habit, or, you know, practicing starting with what you know, it makes the audience pay attention. Or you want to start with acknowledging the previous speaker, or you also want to start with acknowledging the audience, it makes them pay more attention to you. The most important thing is the audience, making sure that the audience are giving you the feedback that you need to effectively make your presentation. Because if the feedback is negative from the audience, it would affect your own presentation. It would affect your own confidence. It will affect the way you are able to carry and comport yourself. We all are human beings. So if you want to pretend like these things don't happen, they happen every single day. People lose their line of thought because the audience were unreceptive. There are persons that have actually lost their line of thought because they made a mistake and the audience started laughing and they never recovered from that embarrassment. There are people that can get embarrassed on stage and still comport themselves enough to continue their presentation. Okay, there are some other persons that can get embarrassed and never recover from it. And it even gets worse because the more they are in that moment of shock and they are struggling to recover from that negative experience, the more the audience knows what is happening to them and they now make it a big deal. And you know that there are some audience that know how to make these things a big deal. All right, so the best things we can do for ourselves as professionals is to always pay attention to what emotional state is this audience. Aside framework, now the reason for this particular teaching is to make sure that we are not shadow boxed to frameworks. Let's keep framework aside. Let's look at the reality of making a presentation without these frameworks. All right, because sometimes too much of knowledge can actually lead people to incapacitation, that you know something so well, and then when you're not able to use that thing that you know, it can now make you mentally incapacitated. So if you are able to decipher where this audience is in terms of the event, it now gives you a clearer understanding as to what should I start with, what should I do first, okay, where should I carry this conversation from, where should I start this conversation from. With that, you'll be able to create an easier reception for yourself. All right, now let's look at the next thing. Okay, so here we have the three starting tools, all right, which is very important. Now, what does these three starting tools mean? You know, I told us something about starting sentence habits, all right. Now, this session, we're going to be looking at the three starting tools. Now, what are the three starting tools? These are entry lines. All right, so you always try to give your audience entry lines. What does entry lines mean? You know, I told us that my own entry line is thank you, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. That's my own entry line. All right, now if you are called to make a presentation, especially when you are trying to give an opinion, all right, especially when you are called to make an opinion or give an opinion about something, one way you can actually start this presentation, all right, is to say something like, oh, one way to look at this is, okay, so they ask you your opinion about, okay, so let's say, Marigold, what's your opinion about the use of digital spaces for business growth? Okay, you can now, I can start by saying one way to look at the internet is as a second assistant. Now you can see that I've been able to start. All right, somebody asks me, what's your thoughts on the use of the internet as an amplifier to business growth? I can actually see it, I can actually start my presentation by saying one way to look at this is, why don't you see the internet as an asset instead of a liability? Or there's been a lot of debate around AI. People have said so much about AI. You know, people are now fighting AI. AI will take people's jobs. People will go jobless. This and this will happen. That and that will happen. And it's now looking like human beings are competing with AI. Now, people are no longer upskilling for growth. They are upskilling to outbeat AI, to outperform artificial intelligence. If you are called to give your opinion about something like this, right? Now you kind of start your presentation by saying, one way to look at this is, instead of seeing AI as the enemy, why don't we start looking at it as an ally? Because with AI, you're able to get first-hand information to ideas and topics that school too, or that's one-liner opening. Okay, now some of these things are soft landings. We call them soft landings because it helps you get comfortable while trying to process everything that's happening inside you. Okay, so that starting line, which is one way to look at this, is usually when you are called to give an opinion about something. All right, now another starting line you can use is when you are called to also share your opinion. Okay, is, my perspective is, because this is an opinion. All right, this is an opinion, you're trying to give your opinion about something. All right, so you can tell them your perspective about this thing, how you see this thing. Okay, now most times when you are called to make your opinion or a contribution around something, now this thing can also be used in panel sessions, especially because we are professionals. We are trying to look at the best situations that are relatable to professionals. Okay, most times professionals face opinions not just in conversations, as the conversations with friends and peers, but in panel discussions. You are called up as a panelist in a speaking engagement or, you know, an event, and you're supposed to be a panelist, and then the person, the moderator, is asking you questions that are trying to throw you off balance. Okay, because it is a perspective, For instance, when they ask you, oh, what is your perspective to the 2027 election? What would you, are you going to be one of the person that will vote the current administration, yada yada yada? If you're someone that is trying to be careful, okay, you know how to tackle these things without shooting yourself in the leg, because most of the time, a lot of persons in a bid to share their opinion have also put themselves in trouble. All right. So in playing safe, you'd realize that when you share your perspective about something, you keep it neutral. You're not saying yes to this person or you're not saying no to this person. You are in between. You're playing non-partisan. All right. Because at the tail end of everything, whatever situation, speaking situation you find yourself in would pass, right? If you're in a speaking situation that has to do with probably something that is related to what is happening in this country, or the situation of what is happening in your personal lives, or what is happening in your work environment, or you're trying to have a difficult conversation with someone, those situations will pass. But what happens after those situations is, are you still going to be able to walk freely after you've made that point? All right. So as professional speakers or as trained speakers, we always have to think from a place of, this thing would pass. Now, there are persons who have jumped into trouble because they were called to make a presentation, and in between the presentation, just inside the presentation, they began to over personalize the topic to the point that they start creating enemies for themselves. All right. Now, the reason why I'm dwelling on this is especially when you are called to share your opinion. Now, people cannot argue your opinion with you because that is your belief. You have a fundamental human right to have an opinion, either positive or negative, about something, and it is right. That is why it's your opinion. People cannot argue your own opinion with you because it's your belief. Just like how people cannot argue your religion because you chose the religion you want to be in. All right. So when you are called to make a presentation, or you're called up impromptu in an opinion based conversation, they're asking you for your opinion about something. They ask you, oh, what do you think about this? Or what do you have to say about this? Can you give us your own thoughts to this? Right? Can you share your perspective about this? Always come from a place of a soft landing. All right. Always come from a place of, giving them an opening that makes it very clear that this is your own perspective. And that is why you see things like, my perspective is, one way I would look at this is, you are giving them your own opinion. All right. Now, your opinion cannot be quoted as being off because it is your opinion. And that is why a person can thrive so well in stupidity, and nobody would argue with them because it is your own. Yes, you live naturally. You don't argue with what trying to make a presentation that is not your own opinion. Now, you always have to look at it from a general perspective. What do I mean by this? So if you are called to make a presentation, or you're called impromptu to speak, and they're asking you, questions that are direct, that need direct answers, please answer them directly. But always play it safe. Question that they're asking you, it requires not just your opinion, but your view about other persons, or you're trying to make a direct comment to someone's personality. It is very important that I state that people protect their personality with so much vigor. A person can come after you just because you tarnished their image or their reputation. All right. So people guard their reputation so strongly that whatever you are saying, especially in a general note, should always carry dignity, should always carry respect for the other person, because a tarnished reputation can, there's this thing they say, that all hell has no fury than a woman scorned. All right. So when a person feels scorned, it's like a cliche or a quote that people use, that all hell has no fury than a woman scorned. It's still the same thing goes to all human beings have no fury, or all hell has no fury than a person scorned. All right. The moment you scorn a person, you're not just insulting them, you're insulting their personality, right? You are making a mockery of their personal investment on themselves. You're making a mockery of all the things they've been able to, survive just to be where they are. That's why it's very important that when we are making presentations as speakers, we have to be very careful as to understanding, is this presentation requiring my opinion personally, or am I supposed to be speaking directly to someone? Am I supposed to be answering directly to, a team or a body or an organization? All right. Now, if someone is making a presentation and it is derogatory to the law academy, that is why people can make presentations or chat on social media and get sued, and you are, facing the law, because you have actually spoken derogatorily. In as much as it is your right, your fundamental human right, to share your thought on something, sometimes understanding what the context of the conversation is, or the context of the question, actually gives you a deeper insight as to which method best suits this question. Where should I start? All right, what should I say first? What should I tackle first? Okay, now with this mindset, you can see that you're not just a communicator, you are also a psychologist, you're also a logical person, you're also an analyst, because in every speaking engagement, you have to put in consideration how your words and your actions would affect the other person. All right, so this is more like a revision class, where we're not just doing revision, but we're also looking at the things that are outside the scope of what we did in class. Okay, because generally, when it comes to presentation and public speaking, people always feel that there is an ultimate secret to becoming a great speaker. There is no ultimate secret to becoming a great speaker. What makes you a great speaker is being flexible. Your ability to adapt to every situation is what makes you a great speaker. These frameworks are only created for you to be able to gain control and mastery over your own thought process. In fact, these frameworks were created to reverse engineer what happens in your body when you are put under pressure. That is what these frameworks were created to do. They were created as more like an antidote to pressure. All right. Now, without the framework, it is very natural for you to freeze, to lose your line of thought, to stutter. But with this framework, even when those feelings come, you know that, oh, you have a structured way to address this thing. You have a structured way to tackle this thing. It gives you control. This framework that we have created, or that we have of this, and they are okay. Frameworks are antidotes to speaking pressures. They are not the overall package. The overall package of becoming an excellent communicator is your ability to dissect the situation. And what do I mean by the situation? Your ability to dissect what audience you are going to be speaking to, and what question you are being asked. Because sometimes people mix the two of them. In a bid to sound smart, you forget that you are speaking to real humans. Okay? And in a bid to also not look silly, you forget that there is a real question that was put in front of you. All right. Now, what do I mean by not look silly? Sometimes people might not genuinely know the answer, but they will still open their mouth and talk without understanding what exactly am I being asked in this situation, that I would not look silly before these people. Because whether we like it or not, in every speaking situation, I would have to emphasize on this, came into my mind. I need to let us know that in every speaking situation, you are being judged. In fact, your greatest critiques in every speaking event are your audience. I'll say it again. The greatest critics in every speaking event are the audience. The audience they're like clay. Their reception is malleable. In as much as certain events, people go to those events because they saw people that they know, they saw speakers that they recognize, they saw people that they respect. Okay? most times when people come to an event, not everyone in the audience knows a single speaker on that speaker's lineup. Not everyone in the audience knows one person there. Now, they are coming with the mindset to adapt to whoever speaks a language that they understand. All right, I'm trying to break down audience mindset for us so that we truly understand how important being a flexible speaker is over mastering frameworks. All right, it is, and there's a reason why we didn't put this topic before the framework, so that you don't downplay the frameworks. Those frameworks are excellent, but the reason why we're talking about this today in respect as to our last class and our revision is that we need you to understand that becoming an excellent communicator is not boxed. It is not set in stone. Instead, as a communicator, you are also doubling as a medical doctor. You know how you go to a doctor with a problem, and instead of them to panic with you, they are trying to dissect the situation so that they can give a direct, prescription that would hit the problem on the head. They're not following you to run everywhere. You're saying, oh, he's paining me here, he's paining me there. The man is no. They're always they're always trying to, okay, in as much as several sicknesses might have the same symptom, audience or taking action. Commenting on social media at this point, I'm actually very, very careful, because you don't even know which comment you will make, and someone from somewhere will reach your house and come and give you a dirty slap. Because as it is now, we every single part of the country is under pressure. All right, and now what does this mean? It means that as a professional, your duty is to also pay attention to what is happening around you, right? What is this a sensitive time to bring up certain topics? Let's say, for instance, you're called to be a guest speaker at a singles event, and then you are talking about divorce. You know that the person that called you to make the presentation is actually having marital crisis. You're not being sensitive. You're not being a sensitive communicator. You're not being a sensitive presenter. Instead, you are actually setting yourself up for not being called next time. All right, so your ability to dissect the audience and know where they are and what is the best way to actually tackle this problem, what is the best way to actually solve this thing. Like I said, every communicator should master the act of communicating by emulating how doctors dissect illnesses. The audience, they are sick. For instance, if you are called to a financial summit, people are coming to that summit because they have money problems. People are coming to that summit because maybe you are called to an investor summit, for instance. People are coming to that event because they have a savings or investment issue. All right, so you have to understand where are this audience at this point. Your ability to dissect the audience is what makes you a great communicator beyond frameworks. All right, so that we don't lynch so strongly on the frameworks that When we are now in a situation where we have applied the frameworks and we still get a bad response, it will now look like, oh, this framework did not work. Oh, what did they even teach us in that Law Academy itself? After I've used all this framework, finish, look at, they even stone me shoe. They will stone you the shoe. In fact, they'll stone you left and right shoe because you did not understand the audience and where they are. Okay, so beyond frameworks, beyond trying to master frameworks, beyond trying to cram and understand these frameworks and some of the things we have done here, the greater work of becoming an excellent communicator after this course, the reason why we are doing this after we have thought all that we have thought in the course is to actually make you more flexible, right? So now, for you to become an excellent communicator, aside what you have learned in class, the best mindset to adapt is, what problem does the person I'm speaking to have that my point can solve? I'll take it again. What problem does the person I'm speaking to have that my point can solve? In most cases, anybody listening to you is listening to you because they have a problem. Nobody organizes an event for nothing. Even events that are organized in the government are organized to solve a problem. All right. So, for instance, they can do like maybe voluntary national review. It is trying to solve a statistics problem as to what is the progress that has been made within this time frame and how can we amplify on a particular sector or decrease a particular sector just so that we can create a balance. It is still a problem they are trying to solve. Okay, so always attacking a communication issue from the point of, what problem does this audience have that what I have to say can solve, would actually make you a more flexible communicator than trying to depend on frameworks. Okay, so if you're called to speak or give your opinion about something, you know that most times in opinion sharing is that the way an idea becomes predominant is if a person is able to sustain a particular thought process and duplicate that thought process across different minds. I'll take it again. The way an idea becomes predominant or the way influence is created is that if a person is able to elevate a thought process so much so that they are now able to duplicate that thought process among different or multiple minds, that thought process has created influence. So when they say someone is an influencer, what do? They magnify a thought process. And that thought process now starts duplicating in a lot of people's minds and it becomes predominant. All right. That is the same thing you're supposed to understand when you are being called to make a presentation based on your opinion. You are trying to sell a thought process to people. You're trying to sell your opinion to people. And so that opinion has to be carefully structured in such a way that if this thing becomes a popular opinion, is it going to be in the positive or in the negative? Is this going to leave this person better or worse? So sometimes people can tell you, what's your opinion about cheating in marriage, as what has been predominant on the internet. And just because you might be an influential person, you don't know how well your influence can actually create a thought pattern in multiple people's minds. So much so that it now becomes your own thought pattern that increases the damage that is happening now in the marital sector. Same thing happens with finance. Same thing happens with trust in business. Somebody can have a bad experience in business and then you are being called to share your opinion as to having a co-founder. All right. I remember, let me give us a little story before we continue. I remember when, I was working very hard as to building the Law Academy, and one of my friends introduced me to this platform where you are supposed to get seed funding, but they said they will not fund people who do not have a co-founder. And to be honest with you, I've had issues with finding a co-founder. Why? Because I had a very terrible experience. And up till now, we don't have a co-founder for the Law Academy. And most grants, most business opportunities you're going to be applying for, they would ask you, do you have a co-founder? Is there someone that is also equally invested in this thing like you are? right? Because without a co-founder, it looks like sole proprietorship, it looks like a business. But with a co-founder, it looks like structure, it looks like a company. All right. Now, no matter how much we've tried to pitch that we have structure, we have, programs that are waiting to be reviewed and approved, we have this and that in place, we've done some registrations, we've gotten approval from this, and people are very skeptical as to not having a co-founder and building in isolation, but they're not even paying attention to your own experiences. Now, let's say, for instance, I'm being called upon to make a presentation as to what is my thought on having a co-founder. If I've gotten to that place of influence where a couple of persons listen to me and I tell them that, see, in this life, I never have a co-founder. If you know what I've gone through in this life because of co-founder, because of business partner, that thought process has become predominant. It is my opinion. There are persons who will tell you that without a technical co-founder, they cannot have a structured business and they must get a co-founder. That is their own thought process. Now, if I'm going to sell my own opinion, it is my opinion, quite all right. But if I'm going to sell that and I do not do it constructively, I can use my opinion to influence 1,000 people negatively. That is why it's very important that even in communication, we also master the act of understanding influence. All right, that as a communicator, you're not just building or saying something in isolation, you are shaping minds. And why do you think things like religious fanaticism build? It built because certain minds or a person came up with a belief system and sold it so excellently that it now became a rule. It became a propaganda. It became a movement. And that is the way we should look at communication. Because beyond excelling at our careers, as persons who are getting better at communication, you are a voice, you are a source, you are an authority in a niche. All right. Now, what do I mean by this? When you look at different sectors in the economy, there are persons who are authorities in those sectors. All right. There are persons who are authorities in agriculture. When it comes to agriculture, there are certain companies that you must mention. For instance, Tribe Agric, Hemam Synergy. All right. These are persons who are authorities in agriculture. So if their CEOs come out to make a comment on something, it flies. When you come to banking, we're looking at Tony Elumelu, because in as much as his bank might not be the most dependable, but he has influence, CEO influence. All right. So there's something when it comes to influence that they say that there are certain CEOs that have influence, and he's one of them. So when maybe you experience a network glitch from UBA, for instance, most times you're running to his own page to confirm this news more than the company's page, because they are called influencer CEOs. He has influence. So when people like that speak, they have the ability to affect a whole generation. Now, just because we might not have that same level of influence as a communicator doesn't mean that within your immediate environment, there are persons who your words, right, might not affect. As a boss, as a leader, as a, as a professional, whatever you say to people have a way of affecting their thought process. And that is why it is very important that we learn to choose our words. Beyond mastering the act of communication, communication should be guided. Otherwise, it becomes a tool for destruction. All right. So, hi, Angela. Good evening. Welcome. Welcome. I noticed when you came in, but we're already, far gone, so I couldn't stop at that then. How are you doing? Good evening. I don't know if you can hear me, but I hope you're good. So we're supposed to write our test, yeah? But let me just give you a little rundown as to what is going on before we continue. So we're supposed to write our test, but then I realized that there are certain aspects of communication that I have not really talked about, not just because they are not in the curriculum, but because they give a holistic experience as to what the course entails. All right. So I did put out like a question as to what we think can be added to make the course better. And Sir Aliu talked about creating a framework for opening and closing remarks. All right. So which framework do you use for opening remark? What framework do you use for closing remark? And I mentioned that these frameworks are going to be added to the kits that you receive during your graduation, or maybe a couple of days after your graduation, just so that we can put everything together, your certificate, your frameworks, the prompts you will use, and the ebook, just so that we give you a holistic package, right, that keeps you going in the course, right? So I'm trying to give you a little background as to what we were doing before you came in, so that you don't feel lost or trying to understand what's really going on. All right, so let's see what the last thing that is left here. Okay, now we're still talking about the three starting tools. All right, which is one way to look at this. My perspective is, and this can be explained in three ways. Now this last one that I mentioned here is usually very useful when you're trying to explain something. All right, this one that I said here, this can be explained in three ways. Now, just to still carry Angela along, okay, we're talking about what to do after you've mastered these frameworks. Okay, you've learned the frameworks, but you're now in a speaking situation where you are in a situation, and then these frameworks are almost trying to now look like a box. They're trying to box you in. You're just being boxed, right? Now you've actually studied these frameworks, you've known them, but when it now comes to trying to speak, right, and you notice that these frameworks are ways to start a conversation without depending on the frameworks. Because like we were saying before you joined, sometimes, people dwell so strongly on these frameworks that it now becomes a self-destructing mechanism. All right, you're now so dependent on the frameworks that even when you are called to make a presentation, if the frameworks escape your mind, the presentation too has escaped your mind, and it now becomes almost incapacitating. Okay, so we have actually looked at, a couple of points before you join. We looked at why you freeze or why you froze during a speaking engagement even after you have mastered this framework. Sometimes you froze because you did not have structure. Sometimes you also froze because you were thinking too much. All right, sometimes a person can freeze because they did not have a starting habit. All right, now I shared that a starting habit can be things that most speakers must say before they start their presentation. All right, and I shared that for someone like me, before I start any presentation, I like to greet, I like to acknowledge the persons that are there by either saying good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon, good evening, whatever the time is. I must greet and I must add distinguished ladies and gentlemen. That is my own starting habit. That is my own sentence starting habit. So that in any case, even if I freeze, the moment I know that I have a starting habit and I'm able to say my starting habit, I find a way to continue my conversation. But why people freeze and make it obvious that they've lost their line of thought, or that they are frozen, is because you have a particular way you wanted to start, maybe with a framework, and in that instance, because you are under visible pressure or physical pressure, you now forget the particular framework you were supposed to use, and you now hang. You're now confused. You don't know what to say next. Now, instead of making it obvious that you have hung, you can pick up your starting habit and use it to gather yourself. And I know I mentioned that in most speaking situations, the moment you are able to speak for at least a minute, the pressure, the tension dies. Because I said before you joined, right, that the highest pressure in every speaking engagement are felt within the first 30 seconds to 1 minute of that speaking engagement. That is when the highest pressures are being felt, because in that instance, the crowd is looking at you, you're trying to organize your thoughts, and there's just so much going on in your head. But if you can break through that first 1 minute or 30 seconds, every other thing becomes easier, your body becomes calmer. All right, so in a situation where you have used these frameworks, you've learned the frameworks like we've just done, and you still notice that you are trying to catch your thoughts, these starting tools were what we're looking at before you joined. All right, and so to all the persons that are streaming, I'm still talking to everyone who is streaming. Okay, these starting tools are the things that you use to start your conversation or to put your thoughts in place. All right, so the first one we looked at was one way to look at this is, and I mentioned that this particular one can be used when you're trying to give your opinion. Okay, when you're called to give your opinion on something, you can say one way to look at this is your opinion. All right, if you're also still on opinion, you're called to share your perspective on something. Okay, you can say my perspective to this is, right, the actual question, or on something like, oh, what are your thoughts about AI and replacing humans in terms of, the current move in employment. You can say your perspective as to what you really think about AI and how feasible it is for AI to replace a person's job. And now this is not limited to AI, but the moment you're called to share your perspective on something or to share your opinion, you can start with making them know that what you're about to say is your perspective. All right, that is why it says here, my perspective to this is, and it's not necessarily that the question can come out as, okay, what is your perspective on this? No, they might ask you a direct question as to, between AI and, humans, who do you think gets the job done better? Now you can start with, my perspective to this is, all right, so you are not being boxed to a framework. Instead, you're diagonizing the situation and choosing which one is better at that instance. Okay, because we've seen a situation where sometimes, because a person has taken a course and you've learned certain frameworks, you're trying to box every situation to that framework, and it now becomes a prison. It now starts affecting you and affecting how well you are able to deliver in any instance. All right, so we're looking at the last point before we go to the next slide. Now, when you are being asked a question, or you're being asked, to make a presentation on something that would be elaborate. Okay, I remember that in one of our frameworks we talked about, breaking things down in 3 points, and which is the 3 point structure framework. All right, now you can say this can be explained in 3 ways, and I remember that in that class I told us that the human brain was designed to process things in threes. The moment you mention something in threes, it's quite easier for people to remember than when you try to mention something in five. Right, if you start saying 5 types of animals, it's more difficult for people to remember five than remember three, because three feels like, it's quick, it's like easy peasy. Do you understand? But if you're trying to make a point, or you're trying to make a presentation, and you know that this particular presentation is going to be extensive, okay, instead of saying, oh, let me break this thing down with, that when we looked at the three structure framework, right, the 3 point structure framework, I told us that we can start with making an extensive definition of the frame of what we want to say. Then we can now start choosing one of those topics and breaking them down. I remember we used things like I remember that the topic we used that day is, what makes a good leader, and we said a good leader should be visionary, a good leader should have emotional intelligence, a good leader should, be able to carry the team along, and all of that. Now, I told us that in that particular framework, you have to mention an overview, right? It's like you're running through what you want to say before you start breaking it down. But in this particular instance, when you cannot even put your thoughts together to run through a simple sentence, when you start with, this can be explained in 3 ways, right? You have already reduced the pressure that you are naturally supposed to feel. Now, the whole idea behind everything we're doing in this course is not just to master frameworks, but to master the act of managing pressure. Because in impromptu presentation, beyond frameworks, beyond courses, what really happens to us in that instance is pressure. The pressure to not embarrass ourselves, the pressure to not lose our line of thought, the pressure to conclude this thing fast before, what is chasing you catch up with you, actually makes people panic. Now, what I'm saying is that beyond these frameworks, the course in itself was designed to help you master the act of managing pressure. So if after you've, looked at all of the frameworks that we've shared, and you now find yourself in a speaking situation where you know that if you want to start choosing a framework, it can even lead you to more confusion or more stress. Start from what you know. Start with mentioning things like, oh, my perspective to this is, or one way to look at this is, do not want to so put yourself in the framework. For instance, they're asking for your opinion as to something, and you now say, okay, because prep is best used for things like opinions, which is point, reason, example, point, you now want to stay on it must be prep. Even if it's not prep, you will not leave that stage. Sometimes you might not even remember the prep structure under that intense level of pressure, and you might now find yourself starting from reason. Now when you now listen to yourself speak, you now tell yourself, oh, I'm starting from reason, oh, but I wanted to use prep. You're now creating internal conflict inside yourself, because following a structure or a framework in impromptu presentation means that you're starting with, what the first framework represents, and you're following it accordingly. That's why it's a framework. But sometimes in that moment of pressure and you want to use prep, you can even forget that prep, the first thing there is P, and you will now start with reason or example. When you now catch yourself, you now be like, no, but prep started with point. You're now trying to go back to your point. That chaos can actually destabilize you. So what do you do to mitigate all of this? Because at the end of mastering these frameworks, there are still real life speaking situations that require or test your mastery of these things that we've done. What I've shared so far is always start from what you know. Okay, because what you know cannot be taken away from you, especially in situations where you're called to give your opinion. I know I mentioned that your opinion is infinite. It is your thought. Nobody is going to question or arrest you or look at you as being dumb for having a certain opinion. All right, but your help, if you are being hell bent on sticking to a framework, that is when it now becomes a struggle, because somewhere at the back of your mind you're feeling guilty because you've taken a class that gave you a framework, but now you're struggling to use those frameworks because you felt like, oh, you've done it for a period of time and then you abandoned it. Now you're faced with a real life speaking situation and you're trying to merge all of these things in your head. And that was why I was saying, earlier, that it is always very important for us to always practice. Now, after this course finishes on Saturday, right? Today is like the last revision slash test, but we're not going to do test again because, I'm going to push all both the test and the exam. We're going to merge it together so that more persons can join, and then everybody can just create like a soft landing for persons who missed the first test. Okay, because if we do a second test now, some persons took excuse. One of us, the person's child is sick. Okay, so if we do a test now, it's not going to be fair to them. A couple of persons took excuse because I guess today is a holiday and people just have things to do. Okay, so one of us, the child is sick, person is in the hospital, and one other excuse or the other, right? So we won't really not hear all of these things and still give test. Rather, we can do a conclusion, right, that everybody can watch, and then we do test and exam together, or we can merge the exam and make the score higher. Normally the exam was supposed to be over 60, but now we can make it over 80 because we did our previous test, which was over 20. All right, so instead of the exam being over 60 previously, okay, we might now use attendance as maybe a second CA. Right, for the persons who have had a certain level of attendance, it now becomes their test. All right, so what we're trying to do before we wrap up and write our exam on Saturday is to debunk the fact that you need to stick to a framework to be an excellent communicator. It's not true. Frameworks are designed to help you manage pressure. Like I was saying earlier, that frameworks are antidotes to pressure. Now, impromptu presentation mastery is your ability to find antidotes that helps you manage your pressure. Because the reason why people freeze during impromptu presentations is because they do not have sufficient antidotes to manage the pressure that comes when they are being put on the spot. And that is why these frameworks were created. That is why our speaking drills were created. That is why we know we've taken classes, we've done the theoretical part, we've done practical, and now we're also trying to debunk the fact that in as much as you have mastered or you've learned these frameworks, the real mastery of communication is mastering your internal conflict and your audience. All right, because at the tail end of everything, Without an audience, there is no speaking event, there is no speaking engagement, there is no anything speaking anything. There is always going to be an audience, and those persons always act as your highest critics. What makes people stutter is because the audience are their highest critics, and most times those criticisms are not verbal. And that is why when you're learning communication, you learn things like non-verbal communication, because in communication, hello, please can you confirm that you can hear me? Hello? Oh, I can't hear you. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you. My I don't know what is happening to MTN here. I'm so sorry, please. I'm so sorry, everyone. I really don't know what is happening to MTN over here. MTN just suddenly lost network completely. I had to switch to another internet. I had to switch to another internet. All right, I'm really sorry for that. All right, so I was saying something about verbal and non-verbal communication, right? That sometimes what you say, right, is way different from how you say it. Okay, now a person can be listening to you. I remember vividly that I was talking about the audience and how that as I'm talking now, you can hear me. All right, but when an audience is giving you non-verbal reactions, it even makes it worse because your facial expression can actually be a means of communication. Okay, and sometimes what even kills a lot of speakers is the non-verbal cues they are getting from the audience. Okay, so a person can be listening to you and they are bored, but they may not verbally tell you because you are on stage. They might not verbally come and say, people should bring down this speaker now, we are tired. They might not say it verbally, but their facial expression can actually wear it so loudly that you become uncomfortable. Okay, so in becoming a great speaker is always diagonizing the audience. And I told us that there are strategies for you to be able to diagnose the audience in terms of, where they are at, in terms of their current emotional status of the event and where you should take them. For instance, if you meet an audience when a speaker has actually taken them to an all-time high, right? Their laughters, their cheers, their memories, there are things you are supposed to do to be able to sustain that energy and to make the audience receive you. Also, if you meet an audience at an all-time low, the person that spoke before you dragged their energy to the bottom, there are things you're supposed to do to be able to take them to a certain level of reception so that whatever you have to say, will not come back at you and then you not feel embarrassed or insulted. All right, so we have like 10 minutes for the class to end, but I have to confirm what is on the next slide before we end this thing. Okay, now, so we also have to emphasize that when it comes to impromptu presentations, right, after you've made your presentation or after you've gone for a speaking engagement, all right, and even before you go for a speaking engagement, when you record yourself, always have a final reflection moment. And that is why along the course we sent a reflection document where we asked questions as to what do you think you could have done better, what did you experience during this period, what and what do you think you should work on, what did you notice in your body, and all of that. Those are reflections that you need to take as someone who is in training, especially when it comes to communication and presentation. Okay, always learn to build on each speaking engagement, even if they are the ones you create for yourself. So you can actually decide to create a speaking engagement series on your own. You have a list of prompts that we're going to give you. Okay, you can use our own prompts or you can generate your own prompts, and then you start speaking with these prompts. Now, when you start speaking with these prompts, record yourself and track your progress. Okay, when you start using the speaking prompts that we're going to give to you as part of your package, right, for your offboarding, that's the graduation package. Remember, we mentioned that maybe on your graduation day or a day or two after graduation, you would receive your offboarding package. It contains prompts, frameworks, the ebook that we are currently putting together that is still under review, and that is the reason why we are saying if it's possible to get it on your day of graduation, because we've written the ebook but we have to send it for review to make sure that it meets certain standards. Okay, when you are in the academia, whatever you're doing has to be reviewed. All right, so we sent our own ebook to be reviewed and we've not gotten the feedback yet. Okay, that's why we're saying that if we don't get a feedback by Saturday, we know that we're sure going to get it in a couple of days after your graduation so that we can send everything at once, right? The frameworks that you can use to practice and record yourself. It's very important. So when you're doing your final reflection after or during your practice, you have to ask yourself, what made me freeze? If you notice that after you've taken this course and you are still freezing when you are trying to record yourself or you're trying to practice these things, you ask yourself, what made me freeze? Why did I freeze? All right, the first thing you should do for yourself is to always be honest with yourself. You can lie to everyone else, but you cannot lie to yourself. If you notice that when you are speaking you are still freezing, you ask yourself, oh, why did I freeze? Okay, sometimes it even happens to tutors. You can be teaching and you lose your line of thought, and subconsciously you ask yourself, why did I lose my line of thought? Am I being distracted? And if you're going to be honest with yourself, you might notice that in that moment when you lost your line of thought, you were distracted, you were thinking of something and you forgot that you were teaching. All right, so when you're trying to practice these things, you ask yourself, oh, why did I freeze? Okay, now if you are also practicing and you're trying to memorize these structures, you have to tell yourself that you're going to use a structure to answer this question, but you not go and check the structure before you answer the question. This is how these things work. If you're practicing how to make impromptu presentations with structures, which is any of the structures that we've given, okay, you can look at the prompts that would give you, or you can generate your own prompts. All right, try to make those presentations without going to your notebook to check for the prompt. Now, when you watch your video back, ask yourself, based on the structure that I learned in class, did it help me? Did those structures I learned in class, help me? All right. Now, if your answer is yes, ask yourself, how many to what percent was I able to stick to the structure, and what structure was I using? Okay, you can start by asking yourself, okay, what structure did I use to attempt this question, and how many percent was I able to use the structure? In our last test, we tested based on structure. All right, we weren't even testing on fluency. We're testing on structure, your ability to stick to the structure. In the last test we did, we used prep, which is point, reason, example, point. All right, so people were learners were tested based on how they were able to use prep. Okay, now you can also test yourself. Let's say, for instance, maybe you want to use past, present, and future. Okay, which is like the story framework. Okay, what happened in the past, what is currently going on now, and then what is your future projection as to this thing. Don't go and check your note and say, okay, I want to use past, future, present. Give yourself the topic and use the framework unconsciously. Then after you've used the framework, you can now check what you said. All right, you can check what you said and see if it is in line with what the framework says. Now you can grade yourself. Okay, if you're trying to use past, future, present, and you notice that maybe you were able to use past and present, you could not use future, be fair enough to grade yourself like someone that knew that they actually made a mistake. All right, just because you're the one grading yourself doesn't mean that you should not lie to yourself. And that was why in our past tests, there was a point when I told, persons to grade themselves. Okay, what do you think you deserve? All right, this is like putting us in practice as to learning to grade ourselves fairly. When you grade yourself fairly, you also give yourself the grade that tells yourself the truth, because if you lie to everyone else, you cannot lie to yourself. When you make a great presentation, you know. And when you do not make a great presentation, you also know. All right. So the best thing to always do is to make sure that you tell yourself the truth when you're trying to get better. Because after this course, and today is practically the last class, Saturday, 1 hour for exams, or 1 hour 30 minutes for exams, and then 30 minutes or 1 hour for graduation, and that is it. Then we transition into the other phase, which is the 1 month access to the academy, where we have 4 classes in the 1 month. All right, so every Saturday we will fix a time where we get on a live call, and then we get to answer your questions or your concerns, or we do practice, live practice, demo practice, just so that these things can stick over a longer period of time. But the truth is that the bulk of the work in becoming a great communicator is not taking a course. The bulk of the work is practice, is doing these things consistently to the point that it becomes an infinite part of you. All right, now what is the next thing, or the last thing to look at, is what improved in the second attempt. Okay, now if you remember vividly that in our test we had a first attempt, and there were some learners that did very badly in the first attempt. After we gave the feedback, all right, and then we made some corrections, by the second test you could see them doing very excellently. And that is why you must always have a second test. So when you're trying to master impromptu presentation, it's not something that you rush. You can dedicate 1 hour, maybe every Friday, every Saturday, depends on when you're free, and be your own examiner. You can actually come back to the class that we took. You can go back to our YouTube channel, to check our live streams, check which classes that we did the test and the feedback. Okay, so grade yourself based on those feedbacks, or you can actually come to me directly on WhatsApp. My WhatsApp number is not hidden on the group. All right, you can actually text me directly. Okay, I did this. Can I get your feedback on this? Right, that is how we get better in impromptu presentation. So when you do the first recording, all right, when you do the first recording of you making a presentation, you watch it, you grade yourself. All right, when you grade yourself, you now give yourself a different topic. It's not like you give yourself one topic and then you now grade yourself and can use that topic again. No, it doesn't work like that. And that was what we did in the test. The first test we did was a different topic. The second test was a different topic and a harder time frame. Okay, the first one was freestyle. The time frame was, I think, 1 minute or 2 minutes. The second one was you must use a structure and you must stick to a time frame. And then the persons who even had to communicate for a longer period of time while using structure did better when they were doing freestyle. And that's to tell you something, that correction and mastery in impromptu presentation comes when you are able to take the correction and apply it, not take the correction and throw it away. All right, when you take the correction and you apply those corrections, you can see yourself doing better. Imagine that someone literally had, I think, 4 or 5 in the first test. By the second test, they had 10/10. And we didn't say go home and go and learn it and then come back, and no, it was live there and then. That's to tell you the power of feedback and making sure that you put yourself in it. All right. So this is our way of saying that, sorry, excuse me. This is our way of saying that the course has officially come to an end, but our exam is on Saturday. All right. So do yourself and do us proud, please. Like I said, we might have an external examiner. Please just give me a second. Thank you. Yeah, so we might have an external examiner, right? So someone might come to listen to you speak impromptu and give you a score. We might. Now, the reason why I said might, it depends on the person's availability. The person we've written to, who is also a great speaker, I've met her at a couple of events, is probably or might probably be on transit on Saturday. All right, this is a very active season for a lot of persons, so I don't really feel bad when certain things cannot hold. All right, so if she gives us the go ahead that she's going to be present, then she's going to be the examiner. If not, my humble self will be your examiner on Saturday. All right, but the criteria is notwithstanding. The reason why I wanted an external person, and not just anybody, but someone who is also a great communicator, is so that this person can be your audience. Yeah, because I might have heard most of us speak a couple of times that we're now getting familiar. All right, but when an external person hears you speak, they don't know you, they've never attended our classes, they don't know anything that is happening with our growth process as to how we started and where we are, they can actually be a better judge. They will not be judging from a point of, okay, compared to where this person is coming from and now they're actually doing well. No, because sometimes when you see your learners make progress, you are tempted to grade them from a place of empathy because you knew where they started. All right, but when you are trying to help people grow, you take empathy away and just tell them as it is. And that is why we're looking at bringing someone who is actually a communicator. Okay, so if we get a go ahead from her that she's going to be around on Saturday, she's going to be the examiner. All right, she's going to be the one to listen to us make our presentation. I'll call the question, tell us the criteria, the structure, and then everything that has to do with the rules, right? Maybe it does the same way we did rules for our test. Okay, so if you missed the test, please go and watch the test. That was like day 4. Today is day 5. All right, so day 4 was the test. Just watch the test so that you can understand what we mean by rules, understand timing. When we say, okay, you're going to speak for 1 minute, not less than 1 minute and not more than 2 minutes, those things are like rules and structures that we use to keep us in check. And the same thing is going to apply for our exam on Saturday. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of today's class and the end of our teaching series for impromptu presentation mastery. This is cohort 1, right? So if you have any questions, please, if you're streaming on YouTube and you have any questions, please come to StreamYard so that we can take your questions. All right, so the persons I'm seeing on StreamYard are the persons I've added to the stage. So Mr. Liu, please, if you have a question, kindly ask. Bashirat, hi, good evening, how are you doing? Please, if you have a question, kindly ask, or you want to make a contribution or you want to say something, right? Please say it so that we can call it a close for today, because we are already at 5 minutes past 9, and as always we like to maintain time. Okay, time is very important to us. So please, if you have a question, kindly ask your question. If you have a question regarding the test, or you have a questions regarding what we did today, and you want to ask a question or anything, please ask the question now so that we can attend to it. All right, we're going to close the class at exactly 10 past 9. So we have roughly 4 minutes to attend to questions. We have roughly 4 minutes to attend to questions. So by exactly 10 past 9, we will call the live stream to a close in preparation for our exam and graduation on Saturday. Yes, please, on Saturday, because it's our graduation, please, everybody should dress fine and you turn on your camera. We're going to put it on the group. Please, everybody should dress fine because we're going to take a picture, more like a virtual picture. All right. Once everybody's camera is on, we're going to inform you that we want to take a picture, so everyone takes their best pose, and then we just take a screenshot of everyone, and then we can use it for our cohort 1 flag, like remembering the persons that were in cohort 1. All right, so if you have a question, please ask. If you have a contribution, oh, thank you. He said it's wonderful and impactful delivery. Thank you so much, Mr. Aliu, for this feedback. We would really appreciate this feedback on our LinkedIn page. So we were on the graduation day, we're going to make a post, right, informing our audience on LinkedIn that our cohort 1 is over. Please, if you want to make a comment, please drop the comment on LinkedIn, right, so that the world can see that there are actual courses that exist to help professionals overcome some of these professional issues that we face. All right, so in the absence of any questions, any comments, thank you so much, everyone, for being a part of this journey. Thank you so much for signing up to this course, for trusting us, even if you didn't really, we didn't really give you a full rundown as to maybe what the course was and what to expect, but you trusted us, trusted the academy, trusted us to deliver, and we're really grateful that we were able to make impact. But this closing remark, we're going to make it on the day of our graduation. So let's just say we still have one more class. We still have one more class, which is our exams and graduation. So, ladies and gentlemen, from the deepest part of my heart, I say thank you so much for being a part of this, and we would see ourselves on the WhatsApp chat group, right? And then on Saturday for our exams. Until later, bye.